Screencast will cover the civil rights movement presentation topics. Remember, you want to keep your presentations 2.5 to 3 minutes. You may or may not want to make a reference to Harlem, the reference to Dream Deferred. And if you're lost on the Federalist anti-federalist debate, which is crucial to understanding the civil rights movement, you might want to take a look at the reading that's posted online, which is a summary. So for the most part, the Federalist anti-federalist debate is about whether or not we're going to have a strong central government. So I'm just going to put this star here, which represents the federal government. And for the most part, those people believing in a strong federal government are the belief that the federal government can pass legislation that the other states have to follow, whereas the anti-federalists question that amount of power and believe that the federal government should not have the power to pass legislation that impacts, we'll say, like North Carolina. So this debate comes up throughout American history, especially with regard to slavery and race. We see here at the Constitutional Convention that prohibiting the importation, this is a reference to slavery here, they're setting a year that prior to this particular year that Congress shall not prohibit the importation of such persons. This is a reference to slaves. So what's going on here is that the federal government is restricted. They cannot pass legislation that says you can no longer import slaves. That is a power that is being denied here, and they set a year time limit, which then Congress can then address that particular situation. So that debate about the Federalist anti-Federalist debate, especially with regard to race, we kind of addressed this already. We used the example here of this girl who was wearing this particular shirt, and the principal wanted to suspend her, and the mother had come in and argued that this was a part of their Southern heritage. So what the argument here is that the federal government has constantly met resistance. I'm going to split up the country in half, North and South. So those states that are primarily in the South have a history of challenging the Federalist government. So I guess that's what makes them patriotic in their view. I mean, if you believe that the reason the American Revolution was fought to give power to the people, why would you give a lot of power to a big federal government here? So the question here now is, who's the true patriot? Are you a true patriot if you follow the federal government, or are you a true patriot if you defy the federal government, and if your decision to defy the federal government really stems from an abuse of power of the federal government? That really is where this particular debate comes from. So the mother here was arguing that her daughter did not do anything that was offensive because she was from the South, her family's from the South, and that the South um, has this particular history. This is part of Southern heritage. This is a quick recap. I mean, we also looked at this particular slide, which addresses some of the tension between the federal and state governments going back since the civil rights. So if we take to the end of the Civil War. So if we take a look at this particular section here, this executive order which integrates the military, that can be viewed as the federal government trying to get involved in the integration of the military. But the problem here, or the difference, would simply be that the military, we're talking about the federal government's military, so their decision to integrate the military would not be a violation of states' rights. So the first presentation topic that you're asked to look at is looking at drive-in movie theaters. Now this one might seem odd, but it looks at this particular debate about whether or not two Americas exist. So by the time we're in the 50s and going into the 60s, you see the boom of suburban America. You see these drive-in movie theaters. Some drive-in movie theaters definitely hostile to African Americans. And so this topic is really just here to get you to think about the two Americas that exist, one for white America, one for black America. You also can take a look at this chart, and you can probably put in here like Asian Americans, gay Americans. There are many Americas that exist, and there are definitely some differences, and the differences will play out throughout the decade. So going back to the 1920s, we know that lynching was a practice. Ida B. Wells was trying to get a lynching bill passed. So let's just say, take that particular example here. Ida B. Wells was a black activist who was trying to stop the practice of lynching African Americans. And so she was trying to pressure the federal government to pass legislation. Well, if the federal government passes legislation that says lynching is not allowed, that could be perceived by some of the southern states and local states, or pretty much any state, that the federal government is trying to tell the states what to do. And we can look at the Dyer bill, which is right here. I highlighted this section. It's really looking at the federal government, whether or not the federal government is going to come down on states, local communities that are allowing lynchings to take place. So that's that one topic. So really, what's going on here is we're looking at the two Americas that exist: the golden age of the suburbs, the drive-in movie theater, which seems to be a nice, safe place. However, that safety net does not exist for all Americans. In particular, we start with the Emmett Till murder in 1955, which is considered the start of the civil rights movement. Brown versus Board of Ed and Brown 2. You probably are familiar with Brown 2. Let's take a look at this graphic here. So here I put the federal and then the state. So we have the federal government and the state government, and they just kind of go back and forth. Brown versus Board of Ed says we're going to integrate the schools, so it starts on the federalist side. The states that don't want to comply with the federal legislation, they're going to use a loophole of time. So what does that mean? That means that Brown versus Board of Ed is perceived as the federal government trying to tell the states what to do. In this case, it's about integrating the schools. Those states and communities that don't want to integrate the schools just use the loophole of time. Well, we're getting to it. So that means that this initial piece of legislation here really is not going to be successful, because if you don't have a time constraint, that means that integration can take place at any point. And that's the loophole that the state side is using, which then forces the federal government to pass another law, or revise Brown and come up with Brown 2, which says we're going to do this with deliberate speed, which now means that the federal government is saying you have to integrate the schools, and we're going to put a time constraint. You got to do it within a certain time period. So now that means I would imagine that integration is going to take place. However, if you're trying to prevent, and you cannot not follow the federal legislation, you have to figure out a way around it. And that's why I keep using the phrase loopholes. So here we have safety. You can think about a situation, if we have a student body of 1,000 white Americans, and out of that we have 2 black Americans, you're probably not going to feel comfortable. Can you really guarantee the safety of these 2 students in 1958? That's really the question here. And the loophole here is safety. I would love to integrate the schools. However, I can't, because if I do, there might be some violence. So now we're not going to integrate the schools, and that forces the federal government to send troops. So what I want you to recognize here is just this constant back and forth that's going on, trying to find these loopholes. Let's take a look at some of these other topics. So I just addressed the Brown case, Brown 2, and here we see the Mother's Day massacre that takes place. The Mother's Day massacre, you'd have to look at this map, which is showing you the travel path for protesters. And these protesters were known to get on buses and try to challenge segregation laws. So in this particular case, they're going to show up. And the public safety commissioner, this individual right here, he knows that the demonstrators are going to show up on Sunday. So the demonstrators are probably going to show up, and they're going to meet some pretty angry people. Put some mean eyes here. They're angry, and they just want to protest. And so you're probably going to have a situation where this could result in some sort of explosion, that these 2 groups are going to go at it. What should happen is you should have the police in that local community there to maintain peace and order. However, Bull Connor makes the decision to just get rid of the cops. The protesters show up on the Sunday, and then riots break out. These 2 go at it. And when questioned about why there was no police presence, his argument was that it was Mother's Day and that the police were enjoying their day off. Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission is another good example of the federal and state governments. And in this particular case, this commission, and I just did a quick search here, Wikipedia search. You could just do a quick Google search to get the specifics on this. You're going to have to add some of the details if you're actually doing this presentation. Was to protect the sovereignty of the state of Mississippi. So this language right here is crucial. If the federal government is trying to pass legislation that says we're moving towards integration, states have to comply. So the argument here is that we're trying to maintain the sovereignty, the independence, and the freedom of Mississippi. So we would love to comply as the state of Mississippi with integration. However, we're really fighting for the sovereignty of states because, once again, it's about states' rights. You may or may not have the presentation on the Medgar Evers assassination. This individual is an NAACP member, and he was assassinated outside of his home. We will watch a documentary about some of the boycotts that he tried to implement. And we have yet another assassination with Malcolm X. Malcolm X usually gets the stigma of being a black nationalist, of a radical, because he was really concerned about the preservation of black America. He was somebody that wanted separation. Malcolm X was also assassinated. Here on this slide just says the Nation of Islam wanted separation. And the end result here is that Malcolm X, you could argue he was the individual who started the Black Power movement, where people started to look at the prior practice of trying to beg the federal government. And his approach was really about having Black Americans kind of stand on their own and preaching self-defense. Now, these two individuals are linked because Medgar Evers, as well as Malcolm X, both of these individuals were assassinated. And you start to see the 60s becoming a little more violent. We talked about the tale of two 60s, how the middle of the decade was a little more quiet, passive, but by the time you get to late 60s, things start to become a little more violent. You start to see some riots and some assassinations that take place. And you can look at like the Watts riots, Newark riots. These are all riots that had occurred. And the Malcolm X eulogy, you want to be able to analyze the eulogy and try to figure out why this individual meant so much to the Black community. One of the other reasons Malcolm X was successful is because he eventually, his ideas led to other movements, other groups coming forward that preached Black nationalism, Black pride, and Black self-defense. One in particular was the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party initially started about over the issue of police brutality. Here we see some of their demands in their 10-point program. So they're looking for freedom to determine their own destiny. They want employment, which is interesting. Is it always about race? At what point is there overlap between race and economics? Or do the two kind of get connected? That's a really terrible Venn diagram. Talking about decent housing, education. So this is all part of the Black Panther Party. I don't know how successful they would have been if it wasn't for Malcolm X laying the foundation for some of the ideas that the Black Panther Party would later pick up on. Another Black Panther Party member was Fred Hampton. See that it's cut off a little here. So Fred Hampton, another individual who was assassinated. This individual was trying to establish the Rainbow Coalition, which was about unifying pretty much the oppressed people. In the 50s, 60s unit presentations, we looked at a term called the New Left. And if we did not, we're hearing this again, the New Left. All of the new, it's an umbrella term, which means the people that are advocating for race, the people that are advocating for LGBT or gay rights history at that particular point, the women, all of the left groups fighting for class, fighting for Asian Americans, that they kind of represent what's called the New Left. Anyway, so Fred Hampton was trying to establish this Rainbow Coalition that really was looking at some of the oppressed groups of America. One of the success of the Black Civil Rights Movement campaign was how it started to act as inspiration for other groups. So on this particular slide, the way you want to read this is that the Black Civil Rights Movement that starts with Emmett Till starts to experience some success, especially 64 with the Civil Rights Act. And then that success leads to a situation where women, gay Americans, Chicanos, and Native Americans, and other groups start to come forward and demand change to try to deal with their feeling of inequality. In this graphic, it's kind of outlining the same kind of idea that the Black Civil Rights Movement starts to inspire others, and then you just kind of see the other groups kind of going forward, trying to address some of their issues. Let's take a look at Ansel Adams and his collection of photographs, Born Free and Equal, which is really looking at the internment camps during World War II. And another group that we could look at would be like the JACL, which was advocating for, immigration restrictions to be removed. But for the most part, Ansel Adams And you may have the topic, the JACL, which was a Japanese organization, and they were fighting to gain back some of the compensation. So with Ansel Adams, it's really about the collection of photographs documenting the Japanese experience in America during World War II and during the Civil Rights Movement. Some of those individuals are going to want compensation for what they had lost during the conflict. Society for Humane Abortion. For this particular topic, you need to think back to the 20s and how the 20s was this time where you see women going through some pretty drastic measures in order to deal with trying to make the decision to get an abortion, which was illegal and still is illegal in the 1960s. So the Society for Humane Abortion was trying to figure out a way to have abortion in a humane way. And you're going to see as women start to gain more rights. For example, let's look at women. Women, they're allowed to vote. They're also experiencing more job opportunities. They're experiencing more freedoms. They're dressing a certain way that was different from prior decades. All of these new freedoms are really changing the nature of women and giving them some more opportunities. And those opportunities mean that they possibly are not getting married. And if they are pregnant, it's really about whether or not they should have the, be able to make that decision to not have that particular child, considering they are then going to be expected to raise that child following the four virtues of society going back to the 1800s. So the Society for Humane Abortion is really about trying to provide a place where women can get those abortions. Let's move on. Ed Roberts. Ed Roberts is another individual who's inspired. There is a movement called the Disability Rights Movement that may or may not sound offensive modern day, but that's what it's called. If you were to look up that phrase, it would be directed to events during the 1960s. But for Ed Roberts was accepted into Berkeley, and then once they found out that he had a medical condition which required the dorm room to be modified, they didn't want him in the university, which led to him challenging that particular decision. And so he's considered, one of the founders of the disability rights movement. Here it says the independent living movement. The Red Guard Party, it says here, is Chinese American youth, and these are individuals. By the time we get to the late 60s, there's enough people who are buying into communist ideas. Like the Black Panther Party would start to believe that communism was going to resolve. The Red Guard Party would be another one. And the question here would be whether or not they're advocating for Asian rights, or are they advocating for poverty, to a reversal of poverty. And that's something that's really by the late 60s where you start to see many groups, women, you start to see African Americans, Asian Americans, gay Americans looking at collective oppression and trying to think about, well, wait a minute, what role does money and class play in our collective feeling of oppression? Mexican Americans. So for the Mexican Americans, we looked at them during World War II. This particular image, the Zoot Suit riots that we addressed. So by the time we get to the Civil Rights Movement, you'd have to go back to like World War II. So World War II, let's use 1940. 1940, we know that immigration to the United States was encouraged from Mexico. So we're going to see Mexicans starting to come over here to work. So if you're here in 1942 and then you have a child, and let's say now that child is 14, that would mean by 1956, they're going through the educational system, um, you know, in the 50s as a high school student. And so the question here is whether or not they have to adapt. So this is going to lead to the bilingual ed movement. And the bilingual ed is going to be about requiring classes to be basically an accommodation. If this individual right here speaks Spanish, is it fair for this individual to be in a classroom where everybody's speaking English and everything is in English? So it's about the modification. They're going to put pressure on the local school boards to try to make adjustments for the fact that these individuals don't speak English and that they're culturally different. Mattachine Society. The Mattachine Society are gay rights activists, and here we see the 14th Amendment. And the reason why I bring this up is because this was a Mattachine Society protest. The Mattachine Society is a gay rights organization, founded, I believe, in 1951 by Harry Hay, 50 or 51. Anyway, what's going on here is you have a local community law, a local law that says you cannot serve homosexuals alcohol. So these individuals are identifying themselves as homosexual, and they're asking to be served beer. If this individual right here, the bartender, denies them service, they're going to take him to court and claim that he violated their 14th Amendment. His argument is then going to be, well, I'm just following the law, which means that when this goes through the courts, the issue is really not going to be about him, but it's really going to be about the law. When we look at the 14th Amendment, it's really about whether or not the states are able to deprive life, liberty, property without due process of law, something as simple as just being served alcohol. 1968, women would protest the Miss America beauty pageant, and this was led by the New York Radical Women, and eventually that would result in the organization called the Witches, Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. So the Witches were concerned about marriage, whereas the New York Radical Women were concerned about the sexual portrayal of women in media. Last up, we have the Native American protests, the Fishins. The Fishins are really about protesting state laws. So let's just say we have the United States and the federal government has created a treaty that says we recognize Native American tribes separately. That within the United States, there is a section that is actually a separate nation, a Native American nation. Well, let's just say in this situation, this state has a law that says you cannot fish. The fishing protest was all about fishing, trying to defy the state law. And then once the state arrests you, all you're going to claim is that I'm not in a position to have to follow state laws because I'm not even a member of your state. I have an agreement with the federal government that means that I am allowed to fish here because we technically own this particular area. Go back to the chart, pretty much talked about, the Black Civil Rights Movement and how that led to other movements coming forward that we had mentioned, Chicanos, gay Americans, Asian Americans, and so on. Last group that we need to address is the Poor People's Campaign. And this is really going back to the late 60s, where you're starting to see, again, collective common oppression, where people are less concerned about what it means to be gay, what it means to be Asian, what it means to be Black, what it means to be white, what it means to be Latino. And they're pretty much looking at this through the lens of the one thing that we all are experiencing is a lack of money. And so now this is about these groups coming forward and possibly trying to rally together where this would be poor people versus the rich. And at that point, we're really talking about potentially communist socialist revolution. And that really is something that's taking place in the late 60s.